In 1995, Cheryl stood on a quiet hilltop, watching her boot roll down the slope and disappear from sight. Profound sadness welled up inside her. 6 weeks earlier, she had embarked on the Pacific Crest Trail, beginning her 100-day trek. These boots had accompanied her across deserts and snowfields, through diverse flora and fauna, and majestic mountain ranges. They had also caused her feet to become calloused and painful. Faced with hardened, blackened toenails, Cheryl could only endure the pain and pull them off one by one. The thought of losing her prized possession crossed her mind once more. Her thoughts drifted back to the days before she set off. When packing, she knew the journey wouldn't be easy. She followed the instructions precisely, stuffing her tent's waterproof cover, food, and other camping gear into her backpack, leaving no openings. Checking her route, she suddenly realized her starting point was in the driest section of the entire trail. It was a desert where even the most experienced hikers couldn't always find a fresh water source. Therefore, before setting off, she filled her water pouches and water bottles. The amount of water she had to carry alone weighed 10 kilograms. Facing a backpack almost half her height, she tried to lift it the first time, but it barely bled. If she couldn't manage it in this guest house, how could she possibly carry it across thousands of miles of treacherous mountains and wilderness? She tried various positions. Finally, she found a way to manage to carry the backpack on her shoulder. She had done many dangerous things in her life, but this was the first time she had ever asked a stranger for a ride, especially since she was alone and wanted to reach the starting point of the Pacific Crest Trail. She either had to hitchhike or walk 12 miles under the scorching sun. She had no other choice. This route stretches across 3 western states of the United States, starting from the California-Mexico border. Following mountain ranges like Laguna, it winds its way into Canadian territory, covering over 2,000 miles. The scenery along the way is breathtaking. After about 100 days of walking, she could reach Ashland, Oregon. Cheryl loved Ashland so much that she chose it as her final destination. After getting off the bus, she went to the route's registration station. Then she opened the metal box and signed her name. Her journey officially began here. Cheryl had never backpacked before, but after all, hiking is just walking, isn't it? She had walked her whole life. Why should she be afraid of another 100 days? However, Cheryl quickly realized she had been too naive. It was the hottest time of day. A swirling wind whipped up dust and sand, and the dry heat lashed against her face. She walked alone through the vast, empty desert. The backpack on her back felt like a mountain. Every step left her breathless. She had only walked 5 miles, and the end of her long journey was still far away. Cheryl began to consider giving up. This kind of heavy, arduous walk was completely different from her usual walks. But this trip wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. Cheryl had been planning it for months. She had been mentally preparing for it ever since her mother's death. She had been depressed for a long time. She had let herself go and lived a miserable existence. She had fallen into drug addiction and infidelity, which ultimately led to the breakdown of her marriage. Then she became pregnant, unexpectedly. On the way to another state for surgery, she suddenly burst into tears. She realized she shouldn't live like this. She couldn't keep going aimlessly. She didn't want to continue living like this anymore, but she didn't know where to start changing. Just when Cheryl was at her most lost and confused, she stumbled upon a travel guide with a stunningly beautiful picture on the cover. The photograph was taken on the winding Pacific Crest Trail beside the lake under that blue sky. The moment it caught her eye, it struck Cheryl's heart, awakening her and making her realize that this guide had shown her path. She decided to go hiking. She reflected on her entire life. She placed her hope of rebirth in this journey. She longed to return to the positive and resilient person she once was. The Pacific Crest Trail was the path to rediscovering her past. But this journey was incredibly arduous. After struggling for hours, she finally found a sheltered spot. She put down her luggage and set up her tent to prepare for the night. The moment she let go of her backpack, the world seemed to brighten. It turned out that most of her fatigue along the way came from the unbearable weight. But the backpack remained a burden she had to carry, just like her life. Despite the tangled mess, she had to face it. After setting up her tent, she took a book of poetry from her backpack. It was Cheryl's mother Bobby's favorite book when she was alive. Cheryl's fingertips traced the yellowed pages. She reread the verses her mother had murmured countless times. Her thoughts drifted unconsciously back to the year Cheryl left home to attend university in the Twin Cities. The school had a policy allowing parents to enroll for free. Bobby always longed for a degree, so she accompanied Cheryl onto the campus. Cheryl wanted everyone to live their own lives, so when they accidentally met on campus, if Cheryl didn't greet her, her mother would pretend they didn't know each other. Coincidentally, they both chose literature as their major. Sometimes, Cheryl would come home from school and sit at her desk, engrossed in her textbooks, while her mother would be on the other side, diligently writing her essays. Under the dim yellow light, the two figures stood silently, peacefully, and harmoniously. But every mealtime, her mother would put down her pen and go into the kitchen to cook. Cheryl had advised her that her younger siblings were grown up and didn't need their mother to worry so much anymore. But her mother only smiled and said, "It It was a mother's responsibility. Before, her mother had always taken care of all her meals. Now Cheryl was alone in the wilderness. The only thing she could rely on was herself. Unexpectedly, she bought the wrong fuel for her stove, so for the next few meals, she could only eat cold rice porridge. At first, Cheryl could tolerate it, but gradually, the bland, mushy porridge, swallowed amidst the howling wind, made her nose sting. She desperately needed something hot to warm her stomach, so she quickly packed her bags and continued her journey to find a place where people live. Along the way, she met Frank, a farmer, preparing to go to the fields. After she pleaded with him, he agreed to take her home for dinner and a hot bath after he finished his work. Such an offer was too tempting. Cheryl couldn't refuse. She got into the farmer's cart. Even when the moon was high in the sky, time seemed to tick by. A growing unease crept into her heart in this desolate suburb. She was just a woman traveling alone. What if this farmer had ill intentions? She would be utterly defenseless. So, when Frank got into the car, Cheryl quickly fabricated a story saying she was going hiking with her husband. They had arranged to meet in Kennedy Meadows. Her words were meant to warn Frank against any bad intentions. Fortunately, Frank didn't take offense. He even laughed and said his wife had prepared dinner and was waiting for them to enjoy a delicious meal. Cheryl went into the bathroom. Whether it was because she had witnessed Frank and his wife's affectionate interaction at the dinner table, or because of the hot water cascading over her, the warmth pulled her memories back. It jolted her back to the time of her divorce from her ex-husband, Paul. Cheryl and Paul had been together for 7 years. Those beautiful and passionate days ended because of betrayal. On the day they signed the divorce papers, they went to the tattoo parlor together. Cheryl has a horse tattooed on her arm. The stinging, burning sensation when the tattoo needle touched her skin was exactly like the heat of the water pouring down, clearly and unforgettable. The next morning, before setting off, Cheryl finally bought some gas for her stove. After a night of conversation, she knew Frank wasn't a bad person, so she frankly told him that she had been divorced for a long time. No one was waiting for her in Kennedy Meadows. Frank understood. After all, it was normal for a woman traveling alone to be cautious. Then Frank curiously asked if she had ever thought about giving up during her hike. In fact, Cheryl wanted to give up every 2 minutes. Hearing this, he advised her to keep going, because when he was young, he had also tried hiking, but gave up on the very first day, and in the years that followed, he missed out on many things. Love, career, his whole life just drifted by blandly and quietly, as if he had never truly made a choice for himself. Now, advanced in age and lacking the strength, he no longer had the opportunity to make up for the regrets of having abandoned his path in the past. Thanks to Frank's help, Cheryl returned to the Pacific Crest Trail. Tonight, she no longer had to shiver from the cold wind while swallowing spoonfuls of cold porridge, because she had a stove to light and a bowl of hot porridge. After resting for another night, Cheryl hoisted her luggage onto her shoulders and continued along her planned route. Throughout this journey, she not only had to constantly change positions to alleviate the aches and pains from the weight of her backpack, but she also remained vigilant for lurking dangers. For example, a rattlesnake hissing right before her eyes, or caterpillars sneaking into her tent at night. Each incident kept her nerves on edge. Cheryl's original plan was to walk 10 miles a day, or approximately that. But due to the delays of the past few days, she was only walking about 5 miles a day. At this rate, it would probably take another 20 years to reach her destination. She had no choice but to speed up. But the further she went, the more the longing for her old life tormented her. No matter how much she ate, her mouth remained tasteless. She kept thinking about the delicious burritos and crispy fries. But Cheryl knew that if she wanted to finish this trek, she had to learn to endure hunger and control her cravings. She didn't want to go back to the past, to the days when she was controlled by drugs. She was determined to master her desires and see it through to the end. Today was Cheryl's 12th day of hiking. She had walked 80 miles in the past few days. Her only companion was the mountain-heavy backpack on her back. The only response she received was the howling of wild animals in the wilderness. Therefore, her feeling of loneliness grew stronger and stronger. She began to hope to meet another hiker along the way. When Cheryl crossed a hilltop, she finally met someone by a nearby lake, another hiker named Greg. Greg had seen Cheryl's name in the trail's register earlier. With a female hiker coming to the area recently, he recognized her immediately. Greg walked very fast, averaging about 20 miles a day, so he could reach Kennedy Meadows tomorrow. Greg planned to stay there for a few days, and they agreed to meet again at the meadows. On the 3rd day after meeting Greg, the 14th day of Cheryl's hike, she finally arrived at Kennedy Meadows. There was a campsite where many hikers gathered to rest. Greg glanced over and saw Cheryl staggering towards him, simply because the enormous backpack on her back was so conspicuous that it was impossible to ignore. After greeting Greg, Cheryl opened the package Paul had sent. Inside were clothes, cash, and a letter. Paul had written this letter just as Cheryl was about to set off. Despite all the unpleasant things that had happened between them, when Paul learned that Cheryl intended to conquer the nearly 2,000-mile journey, he still felt immense respect for her. His letter had brought her great comfort. There was also an old man at campsite who cooked for everyone. He wasn't a hiker, but just a local resident. But every summer, he arrived on time to meticulously care for each visitor. With just a glance, he noticed the blisters on Cheryl's feet. He explained that wearing trekking shoes didn't guarantee comfort. The problem was that her shoes were the wrong size, squeezing so tightly that she damaged her toenails. However, she didn't have much money left and couldn't afford a new pair. When Cheryl mentioned she'd bought them from a well-known outdoor store, the old man reassured her. He said if she called customer service and explained the situation, they would send a new pair to her next stop. He also noticed her backpack was oversized. The miscellaneous items like power cords were unnecessary. He even tore up her travel guidebook, including the entire section about the trail before Kennedy Meadows. After all, that section was already covered. Every little bit helped to lighten Cheryl's load on the road ahead. After eating and resting, Greg told Cheryl about their upcoming route. He had just received news that it had snowed on the mountain 40 miles away. The others were planning to take a detour, wait until they reached lower ground, and then return to the trail. But Cheryl refused to go with Greg. She was here to hike, not to enjoy the scenery in a car. Even if a snowstorm lay ahead, she wanted to walk step by step. Greg looked at Cheryl. Her calm demeanor concealed an extreme stubbornness that worried him. She seemed to particularly enjoy this physical torment, as if only this could resolve her inner turmoil. Unable to convince her, he advised her that if she didn't want to take a car, she should detour to God's Bridge. No matter what, she shouldn't underestimate her own safety. Following Greg's suggestion, Cheryl immediately adjusted her route. She detoured around Renault. First, she called Paul from a public telephone booth to let him know she was safe. Then, she went to the side of the road to hitchhike to continue her journey. Just then, she met a reporter named Jimmy. He mistook her for a homeless person. Jimmy was doing a documentary about the homeless. Cheryl quickly explained that she wasn't. Before embarking on her journey, she had a stable job and had even attended university a few years prior. However, in Jimmy's eyes, people usually only deviate from their normal lives after experiencing a major shock. His professional instincts kicked in, and he followed Cheryl, asking for more details. He wanted to hear her story, but by then, she had found a ride, so she just shook her head, not wanting to say anything more. The people who gave Cheryl a ride this time were a couple. Picture of a young boy hung in the rear-view mirror of their car. Cheryl smiled and struck up a conversation with the wife who was driving. She asked how old their son was. Hearing this, the woman's eyes showed a fleeting sadness she couldn't hide, because their son, 8 years old, had been in a car accident and had passed away. After hearing this, Cheryl felt the world spinning around her. The scene was heartbreakingly familiar. It was also in a car, and she had just learned of the impending death of a loved one. At that time, Cheryl and Bobby were both in their final year of college. In their 4th year, on the way home, her mother was driving, and Cheryl was in the passenger seat. She still vividly remembered the sunset casting its light through the window onto her mother's face, cruelly illuminating the despair in her eyes. Bobby was about to earn her Bachelor of Arts degree in literature. A lifetime as a mother and wife, this was the first time she would be able to live for herself. But at that crucial moment, she was diagnosed with cancer. When the car stopped and the door opened, Cheryl's train of thought was interrupted. She snapped back to reality. Then she returned to the trail and continued walking forward, step by step. This was Cheryl's 30th day of hiking. Looking at the snow-capped peaks before her, she realized just how superficial her understanding of mountains had been before. Cheryl had grown up in the icy Northeast. Although she had gone mountain climbing a few times for fun, she had always thought of mountains as nothing more than undulating slopes of earth. She had never imagined the climate at the foot of the mountain could be so vastly different. Yesterday, she was still at the foot of the mountain, feeling hot and stuffy in just her underwear. Yet now, climbing to the summit, she needed long coats and long pants to ward off the biting cold. And the snow at the summit wasn't old, accumulated snow. Fine snowflakes still drifted down from the sky. While setting up camp, Cheryl unexpectedly encountered a small fox. Curious, she wanted to offer it some food, but the fox merely glanced at her before turning its back and disappearing into the forest. That resolute figure was exactly like her mother's when she was ill. No matter how much Cheryl cried and begged, cancer continued to gnaw away at her mother's life. She could only watch helplessly as her mother weakened day by day. For Cheryl, her mother was everything, because in her memory, her father was a terrible man. He beat her and her 2 younger brothers mercilessly, and her mother, with her frail body, had protected them. By the time Cheryl was 6, her mother mustered the courage to take the 3 of them and leave her father, never to look back. In Cheryl's heart, her mother was her guardian angel, an integral part of her life. They were inseparable. Cheryl didn't believe in gods or goddesses, but for her mother's sake, she spent countless nights praying for a miracle. Ultimately, she failed, and her mother succumbed to her illness, leaving her heartbroken and desperate. After her mother's cremation, Cheryl scattered most of the ashes around her mother's tombstone, swallowing the remaining large pieces. From that moment on, Cheryl's life completely collapsed. She felt as if her soul had been drained away, letting herself sink deeper into a mire. Every day she drank heavily to forget her troubles, paralyzing herself in chaotic relationships. She even resorted to drugs to escape reality. The person she once was devoured little by little, leaving only a walking corpse. But now she's probably getting better, although her mother's pale, cold face on the day she died still flashes through her mind many times. But lately, what Cheryl misses most are the warm moments with her mother. Nights spent together at the study table, reading books, her mother setting down the writing desk and going into the kitchen. Years filled with love. Cheryl still remembers the time before her mother was diagnosed with cancer. Back then, her mother would often hum a tune, a cheerful song. At the time, Cheryl didn't understand how, despite their poverty, their future being uncertain, her mother could still be so cheerful. She asked her mother if she didn't think their situation was terrible. In response to Cheryl's question, Bobby just shook her head and said it was true they didn't have money, but she was rich in love, and she never regretted marrying a scoundrel, an abusive alcoholic, because otherwise, how could she have 3 such lovely children? It was true that life was difficult back then, but they couldn't just dwell on their suffering and lament. They had to find things to cherish. At the time, Cheryl didn't fully understand the weight of those words. She only thought her mother was comforting herself. But now, standing in the wilderness, her mother's words echoed clearly in her ears. Cheryl suddenly understood that her mother wasn't blindly optimistic. It was in that impoverished life that her mother had taught her how to persevere and move forward. Cheryl crossed the snow-covered plains. The air around her was still dry and bitterly cold, but the thick clumps of grass and the silent rows of trees were like a balm for her. Patches of green reaching upwards not only signaled that there was still life and water to survive, but also served as a silent metaphor. If they could take root firmly in the barren land, then she could certainly escape her suffering and live a meaningful life. Today was the 49th day of her journey. Cheryl had traveled half the planned distance. She went to the supply point to receive the package Paul had sent. This time, Paul had clearly written in the letter that he missed Cheryl very much. Just as she was reading and pondering Paul's letter, an unexpected person suddenly appeared before her. The woman's name was Stacy. She was also a hiker. In the more than 600 miles Cheryl had hiked, this was the first time she had met another female hiker like herself. Cheryl intentionally stopped to sit with Stacy on an outdoor bench and chatted for a long time. Through their conversation, Cheryl learned that Greg, whom she had met before, had given up on the heavy snow on the mountain and planned to return the following year to conquer the road. Like Cheryl, Stacy hoped that this trip would help her rediscover herself, but both understood each other implicitly and didn't ask about each other's past. They simply shared their fleeting feelings along the way, and even the wild wind seemed to deepen their empathy. No travel guide could fully describe the mental challenges hikers face. Despair and tears, anxiety, and above all, the torment of both body and mind were constantly shaking Cheryl's resolve. But this was a journey she had begun for her mother and also for herself. So she tightened her backpack straps, signed her name at another registration point, and began a new leg of her journey. Trouble quickly arose. The path was unusually dry. The sun was scorching. In the blink of an eye, she had used up all the water she had brought with her. Worse still, when Cheryl was parched, her water container was empty at the intended watering point. The air was so hot it distorted her vision. The surrounding desert was silent and desolate, filling her with despair. Cheryl desperately licked the dewdrops clinging to the tent canvas, but that meager amount of water couldn't quench her thirst. Even so, she didn't give up and continued forward. She took a deep breath and gritted her teeth, because she believed she would definitely overcome this ordeal. Her mother had left, taking with her the heaviest pain of her life. She had already experienced that, so there's nothing worse in the world than that. It was precisely that stubborn refusal to give up that helped Cheryl find a small puddle of water. She immediately took out the filter she had brought with her and began filtering the water in the puddle. Just then, 2 other hikers stopped by. Out of kindness, she shared some filtered water with them, but the sly gaze of one of them instantly made her nerves tense. A girl traveling alone in the wilderness is always the most vulnerable. Cheryl pretended to pack her things and left. Only after the 2 had gone did she return to continue her journey. Unexpectedly, after just one night, the man with the strange gaze returned, staring at her from head to toe. Fortunately, his companion was alert enough to tell him to leave in time, preventing the situation from escalating. Cheryl was so frightened that her heart raced. She didn't dare stay, so she quickly packed her bags and almost crawled and ran to escape the area. On the 62nd day, Cheryl arrived in Oregon, a city steeped in music. Artists were performing in the streets, which lifted her spirits considerably. Cheryl walked past a roadside cosmetic shop. For some reason, she went in, wanting to try a lipstick on the shelf. But after days of wandering, her face was covered in dust and clearly showed signs of exhaustion. The staff immediately dismissed her for being unkempt and unceremoniously kicked her out. This humiliating experience made Cheryl feel embarrassed. She looked down at her disheveled appearance, a bitter feeling in her heart. Fortunately, Robert, who had struck up a conversation with her on the street, helped her regain some confidence. He owned a music bar and didn't mind her disheveled look at all. On the contrary, he happily invited invited her to his bar that evening to see a performance. Cheryl rented a room to shower, wash her hair, and tidy herself up. Only when she took off her dirty clothes did she see that her tailbone, buttocks, and the front of her shoulders were calloused and reddened from the rubbing of her backpack. But she didn't find those marks ugly at all, for they were medals of courage, proof that she had walked through the wilderness step by step, traces of self-forgiveness and of a journey closer to herself. However, as she left town to return to the trail, she began to miss Paul. She wrote his name on the sand. Now, only 300 miles remained on her journey. Cheryl both longed to finish this leg of the trip and dreaded the moment it ended. What life awaited her then remained a question. She had almost sold all her possessions to gather enough supplies for the journey. Now Cheryl was so poor, she didn't have a penny left, but more than anyone, she understood that she had no other choice. She had no way to escape, nor the right to give up. She could only face it and move forward to start her life anew. Before venturing into the treacherous mountains, she stopped at a bar at the foot of the mountain to pick up a supply package containing food and batteries. She happened to meet 3 other hikers who had also come to pick up supplies. That night, the 4 of them gathered and set up camp near the bar. They were incredibly curious, wondering how Cheryl, traveling alone, had managed to survive until now, despite feeling bored. The next morning when she woke up, the other 3 had given Cheryl a new nickname, Queen of the Trail. The name, both playful and full of admiration, made her smile involuntarily. With 3 more playful friends by her side, her journey became much more lively. After saying goodbye, Cheryl encountered a little boy playing with his grandmother. The boy told her that his mother had once taught him a song, and he began to sing. As soon as the melody rang out, Cheryl froze. It was the very song Bobby loved to hum when she was alive. The familiar tune transported Cheryl back to the days when her mother was still with her. A wave of nostalgia overwhelmed her. She missed her mother terribly. On the 94th day, Cheryl finally reached the Bridge of the Gods. She had spent years becoming the woman her mother had hoped she would be, and then another 4 years, 7 months, and 3 days learning to cope with her mother's absence. At this moment, Cheryl looked north. The path ahead still called her forward. Then she turned her head to look south and reflected on the journey she had taken. The wilderness had taught and tempered her step by step, and she understood very clearly that from beginning to end, there was only one choice in her heart. Human beings can heal themselves by bravely facing their pain. However, the wildness in the film is both cruel and forgiving, much like life itself. It challenges Cheryl to her limits, but at the same time, it gives her space to reflect and regenerate her spirit. She doesn't run away from the past. She carries it with her, confronting, processing, and accepting it step by step. It is this perseverance and honesty with her own emotions that helps her rediscover meaning in life. There are times in life when we suddenly find ourselves standing on a very long road, the future uncertain, the future filled with lost memories. At such times, don't rush to blame yourself for being weak or lost, because everyone goes through such a period where pain outweighs faith, where we no longer recognize ourselves. Mistakes don't make us less valuable, they only remind us that we are still learning to grow. If the road ahead must be walked alone, believe that this solitude will make us stronger. As long as we don't stop, each small step will lead us back to ourselves. What did you think of today's story? Don't forget to leave a comment and let me know. And now, goodbye, and see you again.